Good morning and welcome. I'd like to truly welcome all of you to Grafton's first annual symposium, Trauma Talks. My name is Jim Gaynor. I'm the CEO and president of Grafton, as well as our two recently launched subcorporations, Ukaru Systems, Inc. and ProEventa, Inc. More on that later. It is my great privilege of introducing our keynote speaker. Dr. Janice LaBelle is a licensed board-certified psychologist with more than 30 years' experience in the public sector, working primarily in mental health, but also in child welfare, juvenile justice, and the IDDD populations and agencies. She oversees a statewide system of inpatient, secure residential, and community-based care for children and adolescents, representing over $270 million in budget of contracted services in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Dr. LaBelle leads the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health's nationally recognized restraint and seclusion prevention initiative, as well as a similar interagency initiative with the same focus involving all 7 child-serving state agencies, as well as the public and private special education sector. She is a founding member of the National Association of State Mental Health Directors, Office of Technical Assistance. She's co-authored an evidence-based curriculum on restraint and seclusion prevention and works diligently to implement trauma-informed care and restraint and seclusion prevention efforts throughout the nation and internationally. Dr. LaBelle was awarded the Governor's Carballo Award for her work, which happens to be the highest public service award in Massachusetts. In 2009, Dr. LaBelle and her team received the Gloria Huntley Award from the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill for their statewide restraint and seclusion initiative and prevention effort. In 2010, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, recognized Dr. LaBelle for their Massachusetts statewide system, and its first Restraint and Seclusion Reduction Recognition Award went to her and her team. Dr. LaBelle has provided expert testimony and witness at congressional briefings and legal proceedings as a subject matter expert. She has researched and published on seclusion and restraint-related issues for a long time and presented at many national and international forums. She also happens to be Grafton's latest board chair, and she's a tremendous colleague, mentor, and friend. So please join me in providing a warm welcome for Dr. Janice LaBelle.
Okay, good morning, everybody. How are you? Oh, it's a little quiet. Come on, we're going to be together all day. How are you? Good, great. Well, that's quite a long introduction, and it's a little bit embarrassing. It makes me feel terribly old, but it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be here at this first symposium, and it's also quite an honor and privilege to be working so closely with colleagues from Grafton, where I have nothing but the highest of praise and respect for the incredible work that they do. So thank you for being here. I am going to be weaving together for you different components of work that's been done through NASHBID, through SAMHSA, and helping to teach on trauma-informed care, and the work that I've also done back in Massachusetts. So what you're getting really is a fabric of different presentations that are connected together that creates, I think, is a strong introduction to the construct of trauma, what we do about it, how we understand it, and then some of the pragmatics that we can take home and start to really address the problem of trauma and implementing trauma-informed care. I have a lot of slides here, and the very good news for you is I'm not going to read every single one. I am providing deliberately for you much more content than you will hear me talk about because I'm very compulsive and I want to share as much as I possibly can. So at the very end of this presentation, you have my contact information. If I did not cover something, you have a question that occurs later on, you go home and you read all the PowerPoint material with your significant other and you realize, oh, I had this great question, feel free to shoot me an email, call me, and I'll be happy to discuss further. Quick question I have for you, though. This is going to be an exciting day together. Do you all know each other sitting at your tables? Do you all know who's who? Some yes, some no? Well, just take 30 seconds, turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself. If you don't know him, say, hey, I love that shirt. Okay. Oh, we've got some good-looking shirts out there. Okay. On we go. So trauma talks, and so do you. Here we go. These are the objectives, which you've already seen. Okay, and this is basically what I'm going to cover over the next hour and a half or so. What do we hear? What's the trauma noise? I call it more like a trauma cacophony. You know, how do we define it? How much is there? What's the incidence and prevalence? And how does it ripple into so many different dimensions? And then, frankly, what do we do about it? How do we teach? How do we adapt? How do we start to recognize how trauma affects the body? And then what's on the horizon with trauma understanding and knowledge? So what do we hear? Trauma, as we've come to understand the construct, typically has come from the experience of soldiers coming back from war and conflict and combat. That's kind of the genesis of how we've thought about trauma, but NASHPD was among the first, and that's the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, quite a mouthful. They took that construct of trauma and they extended it beyond the construct of war to the experience of violence and victimization, neglect, loss, domestic violence, terrorism, violence, disasters. And then the DSM-5, how they've defined the most extreme form of trauma response, PTSD. It's not just that something horrific happened. It's then how it translated in that person's experience, how it affected them, their sense of fear, horror, and it overwhelmed their capacity to function and cope. At a very core level, we're looking at the inability to be able to manage some horrific event that impacts functioning and challenges a sense of survival. The most serious types of trauma that tends to get people into some significant mental health difficulties are typically those that are interpersonal. They're repeated. Bessel van der Kolk is a noted trauma expert, and he says this myth abounds about stranger danger when we talk about interpersonal trauma. He said more likely than not, interpersonal trauma is committed by someone known to the victim. But in general, we're talking about something that's repeated, it occurs multiple times. If it happens in childhood, it impacts the development and functioning that can persist into adulthood. That's not to say that single-dose experience can't be equally traumatic. We look at the hurricanes in Louisiana, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and I had the honor of working with several facilities in Louisiana following those episodes. Following the Hurricane Katrina, particularly the youth and the children, particularly in New Orleans, they found there was a direct correlation to weather and school attendance. When it got gray and cloudy and it started to rain, the children feared it was the storms coming back. So single-dose exposure to trauma can be equally impactful. When we look at the most severe form of trauma response, DSM has called it the post-traumatic stress disorder. They've revised their definition of it. We're talking about something in the extreme that's been experienced either directly or indirectly. It's been witnessed. So we're something in the extreme on the order of death or serious injury or threat to bodily integrity. But the DSM has coined the diagnosis of PTSD, but we've had an acknowledgement long time about this phenomena, but called it different things. Does anybody have a rough idea when we first started to pay attention to trauma and called it something different? Shell shock. Exactly right. What else did we call it? Anxiety neurosis. Ooh, that's a reach. And then how about combat fatigue? So those are war analogies, but is that as far back as we can go? No. It was acknowledged in the Civil War. Anyone want to take a guess what it was called? No guesses? Oh, come on. You all just have nice shirts and you were very lively. Okay, we'll get back to that. They called it a soldier's heart, or they called it nostalgia. So there's been a recognition of a traumatic response that goes way back before this diagnosis of PTSD. When we talk about the label itself and that something was witnessed directly or indirectly, we then see the impact of functioning. And we see that this label is actually a misnomer. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder, yet there's nothing post about it because it keeps coming back, because it's relived, it's re-experienced, it comes in the form of flashbacks and nightmares, and then we see a whole chain of sequelae where people start to become detached, there's numbing, they have changes in their mood and their thinking, and they're also on alert. But let's just take a little moment and acknowledge this gentleman. This is one of my new heroes. This is Dr. Jonathan Shea. He works at the Boston Veterans Administration, and I had the opportunity to hear him speak. And he is a trauma expert. He works, obviously, with soldiers coming back from conflict, Afghanistan and Iraq. And he's quite a maverick. He's published widely, written several books on PTSD, and as he said, PTSD is my stock and trade. This is how I earn my bread and butter. I understand the experience of PTSD. I work with men and women coming back from conflict. So he was invited to the Pentagon. He was invited to address the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and really challenged them to really stop and think about the resources, or what he considered to be the insufficient resources that were being appropriated to our men and women coming back from conflict. And what he said, quite frankly, was, excuse me, General Shinseki, you stepped on a landmine when you were in Vietnam, but when you came back from conflict, did anybody ever say to you that you had missing limb disorder? Absolutely not. So why is it that we are now turning a natural reaction to an unnatural situation into a pathology and giving it a label and making it a diagnosis and stigmatizing? So I challenge you to think about PTSD. Is it really a label? Is it a diagnosis? Or is it something more like a natural reaction to an unnatural situation? When we think about trauma, and we have to start to appreciate its history and the language, we have to stay current because the language is always changing. Trauma-informed care has been the application of trauma knowledge, but that's getting to be passé language. So if you want to stay hip and current, think of trauma-informed approach. This is coming out of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. That's our guiding mental health leader in the country. And they're shifting the language because the application of trauma knowledge and what we do about trauma is transcending and going beyond healthcare. It's going into schools. It's going into correctional settings and juvenile justice and employment sectors. So those sectors don't identify as caring settings. They identify as others. So what they've done is shift the language to trauma-informed approach. So if we're going to be trauma-informed and have this approach, we want to be informed by the current literature, the guiding resources that come from the New Freedom Commission reports and the Institute of Medicine, and we want to make sure that we address those things that could be potentially traumatizing or re-traumatizing, things that fundamentally are coercive or create significant conflict. Trauma-informed approach, also coming from SAMHSA, they tried to give us an easy mnemonic so we can understand the dimensions of it. The 3 R's. We want to realize the prevalence, which we're going to talk a lot about, buckle up. We want to recognize the impact, and then we want to respond. We want to do something about it. It's all well and good to understand trauma, to get and have a good understanding about just how much frequency there is in places that we work. But if we don't do something about it, we have just rendered that knowledge absolutely moot. These are key features of a trauma-informed approach, and the good news is I'm not going to parse all those items on that list, but to really appreciate that we're talking about trauma, people's sense of physical safety, emotional safety has been fundamentally compromised, and that's where we start, by creating a safe environment. And because trauma reflects a profound loss of personal control, you want to start to give it back. How do you do that? You create opportunities for voice and choice and empowerment, and I'll be saying much more about that. And I'm not going to let go of the language slide. I just love this one. I did not create this. This is from MissouriMentalHealthTraining.com. And they had a nice way of looking at some of the trauma language because it's being used differently and applied differently. But there's basically a continuum of trauma knowledge and application, from being trauma aware at the individual level to being fully trauma informed. However, I was notified by our Secretary of Health and Human Services in Massachusetts that being trauma informed is no longer sufficient. We now have to be trauma responsive. So to have the knowledge and then to do something about it. Why are we so focused on trauma? Why? Because if we start to look at the data and the extent of trauma, we can't afford to not pay attention to trauma. So kudos to Team Grafton for making this the cornerstone of your first symposium. Let's walk through some of the data, and I'll try to make this interesting, even though sometimes data can be a little bit dry. We look at people who come into the public mental health systems, adults with mental illness. We look at Kim Muser's work. He's out of Dartmouth. He identifies anywhere from half to almost all of the mental health clients being served in the public sector have a history of trauma. South Carolina has done phenomenal work. They have been studying for the last decade on the impact of trauma, but particularly when people come into care settings. And they've created this term called sanctuary harm and sanctuary trauma. And that's the paradoxic trauma that one gets from coming into a care setting and then experiencing restraint, seclusion, loss of control, forced medication, things of that nature. So they found in their study that almost 91% of persons served had histories of trauma. When we look at youth who have emotional disturbance or mental illness, we look at an American inpatient study that found 93% of adolescents in inpatient care had histories of trauma. Well, I'll go one better. In my state, we did a point-in-time analysis. We pulled medical records of all youth who were on inpatient service, and we did an analysis of trauma history. And we did this about 12 years ago and found an 84% history of trauma across every youth served. We replicated that because we've been much more trauma aware and responsive in our state. And what we did when we pulled those medical records 2 years ago, we in fact found a trauma incidence on the order of 98%. What happens when you, I, everyone, all these folks turn into adults and reach majority? What are we looking at when we look at people in the United States, men and women? We're looking at about 50% of the general population and 60% of men will experience one traumatic event in their life. Well, what does that mean? It means trauma is not just in the lives of those that we serve and their families. It's in this room. It could be in your family. It could be with your colleague or people that you're hiring or people that you may be coming to work with. Trauma has become a very, if not frequent, it's not an uncommon circumstance. If there's any good news to that sobering piece of information, is that not everyone will go on to develop the most severe form of trauma response, PTSD, on the order of about 10% of women and 5% of men. But the bad news is, if you do develop PTSD, it typically comes with other comorbid psychiatric conditions, and it typically lasts for several years. We look at people coming in for substance abuse treatment, and we see on the order anywhere from half to 3/4 reported history of childhood or adult trauma. We look at youth coming into juvenile justice settings. Here it's fascinating because the data starts to jump. Why does it jump and why is it scattered? Because it can range from 3 to 50% or up to 90%. What we're seeing, quite frankly, is attitudinal research, depending on the orientation of the juvenile justice setting, state, and service. What we find in certain states, there is a very harsh orientation, and there is not an orientation towards rehabilitation, so questions about trauma are not even being asked. Where we see other states that are much more focused on rehabilitation, they ask the questions, and we see a higher prevalence. And this, to me, is the painful prevalence data. People with intellectual and developmental disability, their risk of being abused increases just by coming into care, 78%, just by being exposed to this disabilities service system. And that sexual abuse incidents are 4 times as common in institutional settings than in the community. That is very painful information. And why? Why? It's believed that because people with intellectual and developmental disability have receptive and expressive language difficulty often, that they're seen as not credible reporters. They're not believed. So in some respects, this population is considered more vulnerable than any other service sector population. What does all this data mean? What it means is that trauma does not play favorites. Trauma can be found across all of our service sectors. And that what we need to do is really start to presume that the people that we serve who are walking through our door, and again, that could be our colleagues as well, have a history of trauma and take universal precautions. There's nothing that precludes adopting a trauma-informed framework in working with our colleagues and in the work that we do. So we take this universal precautions just like we do with HIV and AIDS, and we put on the latex gloves. This is different. We want to put on the kid gloves with trauma-informed. Why are we so focused besides understanding the prevalence? Because trauma is more than an event. Trauma impacts the brain and behavior. And now I have to give a sincere note of thanks to Dr. Glenn Sachs, because the next few slides that have this darkened background are really his work. And he is a phenomenal Canadian psychiatrist who was formerly at Boston Medical Center, and that's where I had the great joy of working with him. He's just the kindest man you could ever meet, and he's also a trauma expert. He has published widely on researched on trauma, developed his own model called trauma systems therapy, where he believes that trauma treatment is not so much in a one-to-one dialogue. It's working with the family, it's working with the schools, it's working with all the people who touch the lives of those who've been traumatized. And he developed one of the 54 trauma centers that SAMHSA funds. And SAMHSA's kind of organizing umbrella for these trauma centers is called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. If you're looking for fantastic, free resources, and I'm a bureaucrat, so I'm all about free. I love things that are free that my colleagues can download. There are great resources on this website, nctsn.org, with great toolkits for educators, toolkits for families and parents. And the challenge to the 54 trauma centers, like Dr. Sachs, who are funded by SAMHSA, is that if you want that SAMHSA dollar to study the form of trauma you're interested in, you must share what you are learning. So there's really great research and thinking at this website. So this is Glenn Sachs's work. And what he says, in order to be true to his Hippocratic oath, to first do no harm, that we have to do everything in our power to attend to trauma. Because when we don't, and when we do things that are coercive or potentially traumatic, like using restraint and seclusion or forced medication, or things that take away power and choice, that we could end up doing more harm instead of no harm. And what he believes is that children or adolescents or adults, the people in our lives who we help care for, all walk to their futures on pathways. And this is another way of thinking about a pathway. And you might say, Janice, that doesn't look like any pathway I've ever seen. What this jumbled collection of lines represents is what's happened to children who've been seriously burned, and they're admitted to a burn center. And at admission, they're given a test called the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Reaction Index Scale, which is quite a mouthful. 3 months later, they're given that test again. So each line represents an individual child's pathway through trauma. And what this jumbled collection of lines tells us very elegantly is that there is no one pathway through trauma. It's experienced differently by each and every person. Okay, are there any neurologists in the room? Perfect. Because we're calling this NeuroLight. I'll try to make this really simple. This is MRI imaging from landmark work done by Dr. Scott DeBalis, and he is with his colleagues currently at Duke. He was previously at the University of Pittsburgh, where he did this work, and he published this study back in 1999 in Biological Psychiatry. This is the first time that MRI imaging was ever used to study the impact of trauma on the developing brain. And what he did using this scientific methodology is he matched subjects, children with no history of trauma, and compared them, matched them with children with profound histories of trauma and PTSD. So what we're looking at right now is what they call a posterior view. We're looking at the back of the brain, and this is a coronal section, so it's up and down like this, and it's as though we're looking right behind someone at their brain. Anyone want to take a guess about which is the brain of the traumatized child? No guesses? Left. People think this brain is the brain of the traumatized child? No. Someone says right. You are correct. The brain on the right is the brain that reflects trauma, and we'll start to walk through why. The first thing that we notice is this white band here looks a lot wider and thicker. That white band is actually a loss of cortical volume. That's epidural space. And what we see is that there is collective atrophy of the cerebral cortex, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain right up here. Anybody know what the nickname is for the prefrontal cortex? Oh, you'll never forget this one, I tell you. It's the Jim Gaynor brain. It's the CEO. This is your CEO. It's the Jim Gaynor part. So this is collective atrophy we see of the cerebral cortex, but also the prefrontal cortex. We also see atrophy of the amygdala. Anybody know what the amygdala is responsible for? Oh, I'm hearing some rumbles. Come on, you good shirt people, you know that. Fight or flight, freeze or flee. This is our internal alarm system. This is what helps us in the state of emergency when we're under threat. This gives us an immediate response to an emergent situation. We see atrophy of the amygdala. We see atrophy of the hippocampus. Anyone know what that's responsible for? Memory, perfect. Yay. Memory and context to a situation, absolutely. What we also see is atrophy right here of the corpus callosum. Anyone know what that is? Jim kind of got it. It's a connective band of tissue. And this is a communicating structure. It communicates information between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. We see atrophy there. So we see atrophy in all of these structures, but fascinatingly, look what we see here. We see enlargements of what these look like. Gray triangles. These are ventricles. These ventricles contain cerebral spinal fluid. We need, and we all have right now, cerebral spinal fluid in our brains going through the ventricles, because its job is to be able to bathe and buffer the brain from assault or wound, and just to be able to function well. In the atrophying of all these cortical structures, we see an expansion of these ventricles. Well, all of this is quite fascinating, but so what? Well, so what is quite startling, because it's much more than just a loss of volume and expansion of ventricles. We see then direct translation about the impact of functioning on all these structures. So people's capacity for reasoning, emotional regulation, and memory are all impaired as a result. Now, the work of Dr. DeBalis has been echoed and reinforced by many others' research since, but one in particular by Dr. Kirsten Conan, who's a psychologist from Boston University, and she did this maverick work. I don't know how she did it, but she decided to study twins who were discordant for trauma. And these were 5-year-old twins, and she got 500 sets. Where she found 500 sets, 1,000 5-year-olds makes me very nervous, but she did it with colleagues in London. And she studied twins discordant for trauma. What does that mean? One twin experienced trauma, the other did not. So she researched and looked at the defining variables between the twins and what the traumatic impact was, and she said the most salient finding she found was, on average, was a loss of 8 IQ points on the twin that experienced trauma. So people said, well, that's interesting, Dr. Conan, but what does that really mean? She said, you don't understand how profound the impact is on the life and the development of that child. It's as though if I could take those twins and put them side by side for you, you would see the equivalent of a loss of 3 inches of height. That's how profound the impact is of the developing brain. So Dr. DeBalis' work, Dr. Conan's work, many more have been used to inform this important document from the Institute of Medicine. It's only about this big, light reading, but it's phenomenal work that really identifies what each of us in this room need to be successful, healthy, functional human beings and adults. They identified 10 core concepts of development. Dr. Sachs basically took 6 of those and used them for this presentation. So what do we want to pay attention to in working with people who experience trauma? We have to stop and think that they have a dysregulated nervous system. I don't really know what that language even means. And that the social environment cannot contain this dysregulation. What we're seeing, people's capacity to control their thinking, their feeling, behavior, it's impaired. And what's more, someone else is noticing. Someone in the social environment is aware of that. And Sandy Bloom is a wonderful psychiatrist. She started the Sanctuary model. She's got a mantra, hurt people, hurt people. It's not surprising that we see people who are traumatized have a tendency to either aggress toward themselves or counter-aggress towards others. So we want to be able to understand that we do things in parallel process in treating trauma. You treat the individual and then work with the environment around them. First core concept, and this is a wordy one, development of children, adolescents, adults unfolds along pathways with trajectories and continuity and discontinuity and transitions. This is such a mouthful. What do we really mean here? We're back to this jumbled collection of lines. Now, we already said there is no one pathway through trauma. What this elegant collection again reminds us is that trauma changes the life course. You will hear people identify their life before they experience their trauma and after. They mark time differently. It changes the direction. Just a reminder about the PTSD definition, we already covered this, something in the extreme that's experienced directly or indirectly, and that it keeps coming back, and that we see people start to not only become kind of withdrawing and numbing from the event, we also start to see people who are hyper-aroused. They're on full alert. They have difficulty sleeping at night, difficulty paying attention in the classroom. They have exaggerated startles. Basically, difficulty maintaining that sense of self-regulation and that behavioral state. Why is that a problem? It steps on an important core concept of development. We have to have the capacity to self-regulate. By the way, you are all self-regulating beautifully. So give yourselves high marks because you're doing it right now. You'll be able to control your behavior. People who've been traumatized don't have that. And when you don't have that, you've got someone with significant challenge because this is a skill that we need. So just a couple of quick examples about the inability to control behavioral state. This comes from Dr. Sachs's case files. Robert's a 22-year-old gentleman. He's in a psychiatric hospital. He's attending group. He's listening. He's participating until he hears the voice of a staff member say something just like his stepfather used to do. Now, his stepfather used to serially abuse him on a nightly basis and would beat him. He heard that voice sound like his stepfather. What did he do? He got up and lunged at staff. What happens when you lunge at staff and you're in a psychiatric hospital? It's not good news. Staff come running, they lay hands on, he gets restrained on the floor, he is frightened to death, he's now checking out, dissociating, and he is now re-experiencing the trauma that he was experienced as a child at the hands of his stepfather. So we see him going from a calm state of being engaged to these discrete stages of different behavior. Shaniqua, 12-year-old girl, she has a history of being raped. She'd been previously in residential care. She went back home, now attending public school, which is near her home. She's in math class. She's participating. She's learning her fractions. All is going well until the boy sitting in the row next to her makes a wisecrack about her breast. She's only 12 years old. She has a history of being raped. What does she do? She's overwhelmed, she's ashamed, she's embarrassed, she's flooded with fear. So she gets up and she is up and out of that classroom. She runs out of school. She ran the 3 blocks home, through the front door, up the stairs, into the bathroom, opened the medicine cabinet, took out razor blades, and started to cut her wrists. Luckily, her mother was home, got her to the hospital. She was okay. But with Shaniqua, we see her go from this discrete state of learning, that prefrontal cortex, that CEO is engaged in learning, to these discrete stages of behavioral emergency. So one of the take-homes is we want our colleagues to be behavioral detectives and appreciate that so much more is happening than we paid attention to, because we would describe that as Shaniqua bolted from class and went home and cut her wrists. But we fail to appreciate those discrete stages of emergency where all of these steps, their sense of self, presence, their mood, their behavior, all of those the dimensions changed between each behavioral state. So the importance of being a good behavioral detective. this capacity to be able to manage in the moment and self-regulate, which, as I said, you're doing a heck of a job, didn't just happen. According to Dr. Peter Wolf, who got permission to go into homes of women who'd just given birth, I don't know how he got their permission to do this, and studied for them for the first 3 or 4 months of their babies' lives. He studied what it took to be able to develop this skill, to be able to go from calm to disorganized and out of control and distressed back to calm again. He said this task of building the skill of self-regulation is critical and starts in infancy. So how many are parents here? Oh, almost everybody. Great. Okay, moms and dads of Virginia, you had your baby. Proud moment. You took your baby home from the hospital or the birthing center. All is well. And you put your baby down in the crib and baby starts to cry. What did you do? Well, Jamie's the only one that picked up his baby. Everybody else let the kid cry. Did anybody else besides Jamie do something? Okay, pick the kid up. And am I doing something else? Soothing, holding. Am I doing anything else? I'm rocking, right? Now, Jamie's baby may have been exceptionally advanced and it only required a one-time approach, but did you have to do that a few times? 5, 10, 30? You did that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in the life of your baby. You were what Dr. Peter Wolf said is the essential ingredient of learning that skill of behavioral regulation. You were the social partner that we all need to be able to self-manage in the moment, to go from calm to distress and back to calm again. So the goal of treatment, what do we want to do? Keep people focused, keep them calm. If they're calm, they're able to learn and stay attentive and use that prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain. So we want to try to prevent the things that can lead to distress and the discontinuity, and we would fundamentally want to build new cognitive structures. And this is where we take a page from our colleagues in ABA, and you're going to hear much more from Chauncey and Jason about this. So this isn't even close to ABA, but we do want to study behavior. We want to look at the pattern. We want to start to appreciate what creates a problem, what's the response to support people in the environment, have good response and neuroregulatory interventions, whether it's ABA or DBT or CBT, and have a good approach and start to build a wedge of cognition so people can stop and think in the moment and respond differently. Next core concept, how's everybody doing? Okay? Okay, we will roll. Human development is shaped by dynamic, continuous interplay between biology and experience. So this dichotomy, is it nature, is it nurture? It's really a false one. Experience sculpts the brain. Oh, look at that. This is Jim Gaynor's brain. Is that a heck of a brain? Right out of the family album. This is actually the work of Dr. Joseph Ledoux, and he's written a book called The Emotional Brain. And he challenges the current thinking about what traditionally researchers said we have a one-size-fits-all to emotions. And he says, not so fast. We have actually a low road and a high load of response. And the low road is fast and it's instinctive, and the high road is slower. It's more measured, it's more thoughtful, and it applies context to the situation. And the critical structures involved with this low road, high road are right here, our amygdala, responsible for, come on, nice short people, fight or flight, freeze or flee, hippocampus, which gives memory. Where's everybody's memory? Come on, hippocampus. And then there's our prefrontal cortex. What's the prefrontal cortex? Oh, you got that one. Okay. So he challenges this notion, and let's see how this thing works. Let's just say, loud bang, back of the room, door slams, that's our stimulus. In it comes. This is Virginia. We know you have higher IQs here. Right away, that information immediately gets transmitted to the sensory thalamus. It's doing its job well. It's a sensory processing clearinghouse, and right away what happens? 15 milliseconds, very short, imperceptibly. You can't look at your watch and track that. Imperceptibly fast. Sensory thalamus does its job, heard that loud bang, back of the room, and it immediately transmits to the amygdala saying, red alert, we got a problem. 30 milliseconds later, more than twice as long, that sensory thalamus then communicates that information to the hippocampus and the cortex. So our first response to that loud bang back of the room, at least mine, is I'm going to jump, right? Maybe our pulse might get a little bit quickened, and our palms might get a little bit clammy, and maybe our respiration starts to pick up. But what happens to people who've been traumatized repeatedly? Let's just say we're going to repeat this training, and we're going to go up to New York City, and we're going to go to the Empire State Building. We're going to be on the 120th floor, and now we're having a loud bang at the back of the room. Are we going to stop and think and wait for the hippocampus and the cortex to kick in after our first startle response? No, because the context has changed, and now we're in post 9/11 New York City. And this is what happens with people who've been traumatized, particularly repeat trauma survivors, is that they are going to sacrifice context in the interest of survival. So they're not going to stop and think and orient and get reestablished. They're going to realize that they're under threat, and they're going to have a fast emergent response to that threat. That's why when you see and work with people who've had trauma histories and you say, why do they go from 0 to 60? That is why. They are taking that low road, fast instinctual road of response, because that road towards analysis and feeling and process management takes twice as long when it comes from the hippocampus and the cortex. So what happens over time? The work of Dr. DeBalis, that pathway is not taken. We see atrophy of the prefrontal and the cerebral cortex. What happens over time? We see atrophy of the hippocampus and the amygdala. What do we want to do? Break up the pattern, study it and break up the pattern. This is landmark work from Dr. Scott Rausch and Bessel van der Kolk. This is the first time that PET scan imaging, and this measures cerebral blood flow through the brain. This is the first time that PET scan imaging was ever used to image brains as people were re-experiencing trauma. So what they did is they asked research participants who had a history of trauma to write out the narrative of their trauma experience, the story of it. And then it was read to them while their brains were being imaged. So what we look at here is image A, B, and lower left C. These are all images of when people are re-experiencing and hearing that trauma script about their trauma experience while their brain is being imaged. So what we see happening to them, we see activation right here of the amygdala, responsible for fight or flight, freeze or flee, and right here, okay, so they're on alert. They're feeling the threat. Then what we see, activation here at the occipital pole. Does anyone know what the occipital lobe is responsible for? Jim got it. Vision. Vision. So when we see and hear trauma survivors describe their sense of panic as though they are reliving and re-seeing and re-experiencing, there is neurologic evidence that supports that claim that they are re-experiencing and re-seeing that trauma that they experienced. Interestingly, when the trauma scripts are over, what we then see is activation of the Broca's area of the brain. This is inferior frontal cortex. Anyone know what that's responsible for? Jim got it. Mr. Neuroscientist over there. Yes, it's responsible for speech production. So only when the traumatic scripts have stopped do we see the capacity for language to be available to people who've experienced trauma. So when we use our strategies to help people calm down and ask them to use their words, we could be looking at speechless terror, looking at something beyond their ability to be able to manage in the moment. So we might want to rethink kind of what we're asking people to do when they're in distress. Okay, bear with me. A little interesting segue here. This is the work of Dr. Jacques Panksepp. He's from Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and he studies the emotional development of mammals. And rats are really his thing. He loves to study rats and doing it for generations. And actually, here's your first piece of useless trivia of the day. They have a special name for rat laughter. Does anyone know what it is? Oh, you'll take this to the next party. It's chirping. Just like birds, rats chirp. And they are actually, according to Dr. Panksepp, very jovial critters. They laugh, 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 play, play, play all day long. And they have these two primary methods of play called dorsal contacts and pins. And what I need really quickly, 4 volunteers up here to really quick demonstrate these types of play. Oh, come on. You all look good today. Okay, no volunteers, really? I think I saw Jamie start to get up. Okay. So Dr. Panksepp studies these rats play with dorsal contacts and pins all day long. And what he does is he decides to introduce a minimal fear stimulus. He takes a single cat hair. These are lab rats, raised for generations in the lab, not on the street. They don't even know what a cat is. He takes a single cat hair and he puts it in the cage with the rats. What happens? All play stops for the 24 hours that single cat hair is in the cage with the rat. He takes it out. What happens? Play never resumes to the same level ever again in the life of those rats. So we think about the impact of something that's traumatizing, triggering. We think about the people that we serve. Now, obviously, we don't work with rats, but we have to take home here this information and really stop and think about the effect of trauma and what it does. Urie Bronfenbrenner, he created a wonderful model, first called it the social ecological model, then called it the bioecological model. He said in order for any of us to be healthy, functional, well-adapted human beings, we need to be nested in layers of support. That includes our family, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, our churches, our culture, and that fundamentally these layers of support are needed to be able to manage life crises, whether we've got illness or car accidents, divorce. We need this because implicit in all of these layers of support are healthy human relationships. It's a core concept of development. Without it, we cannot be successful. And in this room, like you are here today, it's a building block of healthy development. We think about youth and children who've been traumatized. Attachment is relationship 101. That capacity to build a partnership has been stepped on. So what are we setting into motion then? We're setting up people whose capacity to trust, to form relationship, to be cool, calm, collected, and learning is highly impaired. Attachment is the very beginning of that relationship. So when people, particularly children, experience trauma, we then see fundamental relationship deficit, and they're on full alert. They don't trust. They're emotionally reactive and brittle. They hold on to grievances. They're stuck in that low road of response. They're not stopping and thinking and processing. This takes us to the next core concept, that children or adolescents or adults are active participants in their own development, that we have a fundamental intrinsic human drive to explore and master our environment. You did it today by just picking your table and where do you want to sit and what's the right spot for me. That's mastery at a very basic level. But when we stop and think about the problematic behavior that's created the difficulty when traumatized youth or adolescents or adults seeking services, that behavior is often labeled as the pathology, when in fact we should be stopping and thinking that that behavior makes complete sense in a chaotic environment. It's highly adaptive, it served an important purpose, and that in those moments, they're doing the very best that they can, and our job is to help understand the pattern and teach to a new skill set. This leads us to the last core concept that Dr. Sachs wanted to extract from the Institute of Medicine. The good news slide, I call it, that the course of development can be altered. It's not a one-way course to just a bad outcome given a horrible traumatic effect, that we can in fact start to shift the odds in favor of a much more healthier outcome. There is a lot of exciting research that's going on right now in the field of trauma and trauma treatment that's taking a page from traumatic brain injury and really looking at brain plasticity, neural genesis. Years ago, the thinking was, when you're born, you've got what you've got. That's all your white and gray matter. That's all you got. That's not the case. We know that, in fact, that we can create neural genesis. One of the best modes of helping to create healing for the brain is, what do they do when someone's been in a car accident? What's the mantra from traumatic brain injury? You want to stimulate, stimulate, stimulate. And you want to get people up and physically moving. That's why phys ed in school, and one of the first things that gets cut, terrible. Kids have got to be moving. It helps them to cognitively organize and stay focused. That's what we want to do with the people that we serve. Very hard to do because a number of the medicines that we do creates lethargy, takes away energy. Very hard to move. But we want to get people up and moving because it increases volume oxygenation, it increases blood flow, it creates new neural connections. Good antidepressant medication will also promote neurogenesis. And then there's a whole cadre of new thinking about procedural learning, which I'll talk about a little bit later, about how to understand the sequence of trauma and how to interrupt it a little bit differently. Okay, so trauma impacts the brain and the behavior. Is there anything else? Yes. Have you heard of the ACE study? This is the single largest public health research ever done in the United States, and it is still ongoing. You can go to the CDC's website and get volumes of data on the ACE study. This is landmark work done by these two researchers. The gentleman on the left is Robert Anda. The gentleman on the right is Vince Felitti. They teamed up. Robert Anda's at the CDC. Vince Felitti was with Kaiser Permanente. He was with a health insurance company in California. And they couldn't figure out, because his expertise was weight loss, why is it that people lose weight and they're putting it back on, and wanted to understand better. So together, Dr. Anda and Dr. Felitti came up with a very simple 10-item questionnaire, which you have on your table. And that was an inventory of kind of adverse childhood experiences. It's very simple. They inventoried 17,000 people from Kaiser Permanente, and this is in San Diego County, with this 10-item survey. And the questions are very simple. Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other or feel close to each other? If so, that's a score of 1. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? If yes, answer 1. So you can read the list of questions, but ultimately, if you answered yes to everything, you would have a score of 10. And what they found when they interviewed these 17,000 people and got their ACE scores is that 2/3 of the people had at least a score of 1. Then they found that 20% had a score of 3 ACEs or more. And what they found is that the higher the ACE score, the higher the adoption of health risk behaviors and comorbid medical problems and disease, and the shorter the lifespan. Higher the ACE score, the shorter the life. Very profound research. They are still mining the data, so you can go to the CDC and really get the full depth, but I'll give you a snapshot. The higher the ACE score, the more we're going to see people who are impaired in the workplace in terms of absenteeism, financial problems, and serious problems performing on the job. The higher the ACE score, the more likely we're going to see chronic depression. The higher the ACE score, we're going to see suicide attempts. The higher the ACE score, we're going to see teen sexual behavior and pregnancy. The higher the ACE score, we're going to see the risk of being raped. The higher the ACE score, we're going to see smoking. We're going to see COPD. We're going to see adult alcoholism. We're going to see the risk of perpetrating domestic violence. We're going to see the risk for heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, suicide, substance abuse, HIV, and sexually transmitted diseases. So you can find your own ACE score by looking at this, or you can download the format. Now, it's a very powerful study. It's still, as I said, that they're still doing active research with the ACE data. From my perspective, it's powerful data, but if we look to Canada and the National Health Service and their data, it's even more robust. They took essentially a corollary of the ACE study in one province, which is a state, and they looked at Ontario, and they asked everybody to fill out a similar type of tool and found that with their 10,000 participants, about 30% had physical abuse or sexual abuse histories. They also found, like the ACE study, a strong correlation between early trauma, health risk adoption of behavior, and then comorbid physical health problems. So what's the difference in these studies? The difference is that Kaiser Permanente was all self-report. This study from Canada, which you can go to statcan.gov and look at all of their data because it's all online, it's much more robust because it directly ties to healthcare cost, healthcare utilization, and actual longevity. Everything else in the ACE study was self-report. This is tied to actual data that is much more robust and powerful. Okay, so this is a lot of information. What are we going to do about it? We'll start paying attention. We'll start to survey what is and isn't trauma-informed practice. Okay, there are a lot of bullets on the next few slides. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to kind of extract a few. And we're going to stop and think about what's trauma-informed versus what's not trauma-informed. If you're trauma-informed, and you're going to start paying attention to trauma and the high prevalence of trauma, you're going to start to assess and ask questions about a history of trauma and how that trauma is manifest. So you're going to ask questions. You're going to expect the high prevalence. If you're Julie LaRue, well, who the heck is Julie LaRue? Julie is a nurse manager, and she runs a psychiatric emergency department on Cape Cod. By definition, she knows that people walking through her door are in extreme distress. What does she do? Not only is she asking the first responders who are bringing the people in, what's the history of trauma if known? She's immediately trying to make collateral contacts, but she goes further. She starts to look at the environment. She changes the color from a drab gray to a pale pastel pink. She's got plants, she's got a fish tank, she's got a person with lived experience on staff, she's got a service dog on staff, and the first words out of her mouth after she's tried to get a trauma history before the person walks through the door is usually like, "Get the popcorn." I said, "Julie, really? Popcorn at a time like this? What's that about?" And she says, "You don't get it." She said, "I am doing everything I can do to immediately assess the situation, but when someone's coming in distress, I want to create immediate olfactory sensation. I want people to smell that this is a comforting place." So whether she throws in the microwave brownies or the popcorn, she wants to start to create an immediate sensation of comfort. So she surrounds, so she said, "I may not have the information that I need, but I'm going to presume trauma, and I'm going to do everything I can do within the environment to make a nice, soft entry for people." If you're trauma-informed, you're going to pay attention to those things that take away a person's sense of control. We said at the core of trauma experience is a profound loss of control, so those things that speak of power and control are going to be addressed. So if you're Maggie Bennington Davis, I know you want to know who's Maggie Bennington Davis. I'll tell you. She's a psychiatrist, and she works at Salem Hospital in Oregon, and she has done a phenomenal way of implementing the sanctuary model, a trauma model, at her unit and moving away from restraint and seclusion and forced medication. So she was a good student of Sandy Bloom, the architect of the sanctuary model, and she said, "Sandy, would you please come to my unit and help me understand what I need to do and where I need to start?" Sandy said, "Sure." And so Sandy goes from Philadelphia out to Oregon, gets to Maggie's unit, gets to the front door, rings the doorbell. Maggie comes out. "Great, glad you're here. We've got a whole day planned. We've got my staff ready to meet you. We'll start with the tour." And she said, "Time out, Maggie. Not so fast. I can't even step foot into your unit. Did you ever stop and look about your signage on the front door here? Police leave guns here." She said, "What have you communicated to people with a history of trauma? This is an unsafe place." So we have to stop and think about what the environment looks and those things that take away power and control. Now, this is an example of something that's not trauma-informed. As I said, I had the opportunity to work with a number of states during the Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in Louisiana, but also in the South with the SAMHSA initiative. And one such facility had a lot of chaos. There was a lot of anger, aggression, staff getting hurt. The patients were kind of assaulting each other. Their remedy to that was to hire by the pound. And so they got big staff, big men, big women, gave them a uniform, gave them a fake badge, gave them a big keys, gave them a billy club, and told them that your job title is now therapeutic guard. And your job is to stand in the hall, hands on hips, and someone comes out and they start to linger. You tell them, no, they got to go to this group, and you start to bark out where they have to go. They thought that was the remedy. What they failed to understand was that they had high degrees of traumatized individuals in their midst, and this was the exactly wrong thing to do. Trauma-informed care environment is going to understand that all behavior has meaning, right? And they're going to pay attention to that behavior, be good behavioral detectives, and start to look at the language that we use to describe that behavior. So if you're Kathy Regan, and I know you want to know, so I'm going to tell you, Kathy Regan is the nurse manager of the Cambridge Health Alliance up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one of the services she oversees is a pediatric inpatient service. This is the first service that we had that stopped using restraint and seclusion. And Kathy said, you know, in order for us to start to pay attention, we had to look at whether or not we even liked the work that we did, liked working with the youth and the children in our care. Because when you stop and read the language of how we describe them, you'd wonder if we liked them at all. So she said, we spent months looking at all the language that we used that was frankly shaming and blaming and pejorative, and that they would use and document. And when you document, particularly for a kid, where do those reports go? They go to the schools, they go to the next level of care. That becomes the living legend and lore that then paves the way for that future. It can keep kids out of jobs, military, college, so it's very powerful. So she said, we're going to pay attention to language as we're making our shift into trauma-informed care. So what does she do? With her staff, she starts to identify old language and new language. And they create master lists, and they put them all around the staff office so they can make this conversion from old language to new language. In the past, they would have described behavior like acting out. Not anymore. Now they'll call it a skills deficit. In the past, they would have labeled a kid as manipulative. No, now it's difficulty problem solving. So they create up lists of old language and new translation and started to make their culture shift that way, because we transmit culture orally, verbally, and that's one place she wanted to start. She also appreciated that she needed to be transparent to advocates and to other collaterals, particularly families, and she looked at the signage on her front door and realized she had these arcane visiting hours. You can come from 2 to 4, 5 to 7. She said, those hours made no sense. These were for staff convenience. These were not at family convenience. She took it down. I said, what'd you replace it with, Kathy? Well, nothing. Come when you can. That's the visiting hour. Come when you are able. And some of her staff got a little worried. Oh, Kathy, what if they want to come at 7 o'clock? Well, great, they can have dinner. Well, what if they want to come at 9 o'clock? Well, good, they can help their child settle. What if they want to come at night? Good, we want them to come. If they want to come spend the night, please come spend the night. You are the linchpin to your child's future. We want them to know what we know. We want to be able to have them be a part of this treatment. So being very transparent, part of being trauma-informed. So core competency of being trauma-informed, having empathy and compassion. So how would you feel if the mouse did that to you? Okay, what do we call that? Kim knows. This is the golden rule thinking, right? Do unto others. But this is Virginia. You can go so much further. I say we make this the platinum rule. Why are we using ourselves as a standard? Do unto others as we have them do unto you? No, 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 no. Let's do unto others as they wish to be treated. Let's use their preference as the compass and not our own. That's the platinum rule. What would you hear if you're in a trauma-informed environment? You're going to hear a different tone. You're going to hear different volume. You're going to have people respect that loud noise can be triggering. So there's going to be much more presence of people being out and about and being respectful and well-mannered. And if you're Tim Murphy and you're from Oregon and you've implemented an approach of changing your culture, you want to take a page from Disney. And that's what he did. He said, I have to teach my staff Manners 101. So he went to the Disney curriculum, which they really won't give you, so he bought books on it and he studied it. And one of the cornerstones of Disney's work is what they call being, it's having aggressive friendliness. So it's all about meeting people's needs by being aggressively friendly and looking for those moments of conflict and moments of difficulty in order to be able to nip it in the bud. So in Tim's approach, he implemented this kind of Disney, Marriott-like approach to good customer service. He said, I realized if I was meeting people's needs, I sit down with them at lunch and I'm having, sandwich them, and we're having a good interaction and relationship, they're much less likely to throw a chair at me in the afternoon because I've helped establish a relationship and I'm meeting needs. What would you see in a trauma-informed environment? Well, if you want to go scan your own environments, courtesy of our colleagues in Nebraska, on your tables, you have this really elaborate tool about being able to assess an environment. There are a lot of tools that are now out. Kevin Huckshore and I just wrote one for a chapter we wrote in a book together. But this is just a sample if you want to start to survey your environment as a very basic place to go about implementing trauma-informed approaches. So you're going to look at what keeps you away from the people that you are there to serve. So in hospital settings, those nurses' stations are great places for people to hide out, like staff offices are, and be sequestered. And when that happens, you're too far removed from those that you serve. So this happened with Kathy Fuentes and her colleagues at Boston Medical Center, when staff said, you know, Kathy, please don't tell us to keep de-escalating. We're really hard and tired of de-escalating, because they had a program full of traumatized youth, and that's what they were in the business of, was trying to de-escalate problems. And she said, well, what do you mean you want to de-escalate? And they said, well, we want to get to pre-de-escalate. If we're having to be de-escalating, we already have a problem. It's already a problem. We're already either 5 minutes or 5 steps behind. So she said, well, what's the solution? We got to be present. So what do you want to do? Let's take down the nurses' station. And that's exactly what they did. And they created a relaxation station, and we replicated that throughout a number of our facilities, including our brand new one. And I'll show you some pictures of that. So you're going to be much more present and available. So they deconstructed their nurses' station, took down the Lexan panels. So now staff are always out and about and there to meet the person's served needs. You're going to look at the environment of care. You're going to look at the setting. Is it clean? Is it neat? Is it organized? Do people have smaller settings to be able to sit and have conversation? Typically, we have sofas. That's forced intimacy. If you've got a history of interpersonal violence, you may not want to be sitting next to somebody very closely on a sofa. So looking at small, kind of what Maggie calls her Starbucks arrangements, creating clustered seating environments, making sure that there is soothing artwork, and having calming images. And basically using yourselves to ask the question, would I want to be here, the place that I work? Is this a place that makes me feel safe, secure? Would the staff that are working here make me feel safe and secure? So now what do? We've asked all these questions. We're surveying the environment. Now we're going to assess and respond to trauma. In my state, if anybody wants to come work in Massachusetts, we would welcome it. But the first thing that you're going to learn is trauma assessment. It's required for all of our services. So when you come into behavioral health or our child welfare residential programs, we will be doing trauma assessment. This is different than trauma treatment. We are not going to get into long depth meaning making. This is really to understand what's happened and start to do something about it. So we want to look at the past and assess for current trauma. We want to look at how it's manifests in day-to-day life. We want to look at those symptoms, and we want to start to help to create an intervention that meets their needs. So in order to do that, you have to understand the type of trauma that was experienced. For some trauma, youth, if they've been locked in a closet when they're a child and then put into a seclusion or timeout room, what do you think that replicates and is re-triggering and re-traumatizing? So we want to understand what that experience was, how old they were when it happened, who perpetrated it, what was the frequency, and then do something about it. What I love about Sandy Bloom, I described her as the sanctuary model guru. She's changed the thinking. In our medical model approaches, we are really good at thinking about things in terms of diagnosis and pathology and labels. And she takes that away, because when we do that, we locate the problem within the person. What Sandy Bloom does, she changes the question. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. The locus has shifted to something in the external. So we want to start to understand and ask a basic question about what happened. And that's a very different question to ask. It doesn't feel so personally assaulting. As opposed, when you feel and you're being asked what's wrong, you're being blamed. You're a walking pathology. When the dialogue shifts to what happened, you open up the conversation in a different way. Trauma assessment is a very sensitive dialogue to have. It should be done as soon as you possibly can to at least get a rough idea. You may not get any information right away, but it should be done sooner rather than later. And it's really a very sensitive issue of inquiry that's really the beginning of therapeutic engagement. So we ask about risk, past and current, and we start to develop a plan. And then we have an incumbent responsibility to do something. If someone says, yes, this happened to me, you cannot walk away from that information. You must do something, and I'll be really interested of full disclosure. Let me just tell you, as I said, in my state, everyone must do an assessment for trauma. One of the biggest problems we have is then having our facilities, our programs, translate that information and then change the treatment, change the intervention, work with our collaterals in the schools and other treating centers. We do not do a very good job at responding to that information effectively. Youth and children may not have language to identify what's happened to them. We're going to have to get it through good observational skill, directly asking others. And then we start to appreciate the range of different types of behaviors that can be displayed because of a traumatic exposure. What I love about this list, it runs the gamut. We see the response to trauma can be people who completely detach, withdraw, dissociate, and they are shut down, to others who completely aggress outwards. So we see people who can be, experiencing flashbacks and hypervigilance and anxiety, or they can be aggressing and injuring themselves or others, or abusing substances. If Glenn Sachs were here right now, he'd have a little fit and he'd say, Janice, why did you just do that? Look at that slide. You've called them a symptom. And what he would tell us is that that's not a symptom. The response to trauma is adaptive. These are necessary strategies, again, that make sense in a chaotic circumstance. They don't make sense when the trauma is removed, but we have just pathologized when we start to call these symptoms. So the focus of the work that we do is really about assessing for safety, teaching to good self-management skill, and then teaching to a good roster of important cognitive skills to teach to what we called earlier that wedge of cognition, so that people have fundamental skills to be able to self-manage. Also, having good use of medication on board is equally important. But just to be aware, we've got a lot of trauma treatment models that are evidence-based practices, and the literature is not too complimentary right now. There are a couple of important studies out. One is a Cochrane review, and this one by AHRQ, that did an analysis of all the available literature on evidence-based practice and treating traumatized children and adolescents. And they found a lot, more than 6,000 research abstracts, 21 trials, one cohort study, not one replication study of effective interventions, no pharmacotherapy intervention demonstrated effectiveness. And there was one exception, but in general, studies with active controls did not show benefit. The one promising evidence-based practice appeared to be a school-based treatment with elements of a cognitive approach like a CBT. But the authors were very harsh, and they said the evidence provides no insight on how these interventions might influence long-term healthy development. And that's one of the resounding criticisms of evidence-based practice. They don't generalize outside of the environment in which it's taught. So they say there's little evidence on how effectiveness might vary by child characteristics, no evidence on how it might vary by treatment characteristics or setting, and that this is a fundamental call to action. So it's a kind of a word to the wise caution about what we need to pay attention to as we think about some of our evidence-based practices or practice-based evidence. What else can we do? We can do so much more. We can start to use other tools to prevent re-traumatization, and we can have strategies for self-soothing and calming. Now, how is everybody doing? You're sitting a long time. You're self-regulating beautifully, by the way. Is everybody okay? Yeah? I do want to encourage you, if you feel the need to stretch or stand up in the back, you feel free, because this is a long time to be sitting. I can tell you what they do in Canada, and I've trained a lot up there. This is no joke. After the first hour, they say, lève, and they make everybody stand up. This is no joke. And they'll do, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they make everybody get up and move. And they do it not so much as a good physical exercise, but it's another way to maintain your focus and attention. So if anybody's in the move, or you want to start the wave around the room, you feel free, because this is a long time to be sitting. Okay, pragmatic tools. What can we do to promote learning and self-regulation? Our best tool is our staff, our colleagues, the people that we work with, how we hire, who we hire are important because we've got essential core qualities. You want to prevent trauma, re-traumatization, and have people who are really masterful at creating a soothing, wonderful environment, you're going to hire to them. And that's what Per Anders Rydelius did. Who is he? Well, there's his picture right there. Doesn't he look like a nice man? He is the head of Swedish psychiatry. And I had the opportunity to present with him in Istanbul. And I went first, and he was quite the gentleman, so I presented on trauma-informed care and what we're doing in the United States on moving away from restraint and seclusion and the trauma platform that we've adopted, and that we really are working very hard to move away from coercive interventions. And I sat down, and Dr. Rydelius said, "Oh, Dr. LaBelle, that was a wonderful presentation." He said, "Well, in Sweden, we don't use restraint or seclusion. We really don't have coercive practice in our children's settings." And I just wanted to melt. And I'm ever the cynic and skeptic because I was feeling pretty good about the reduction work that we've been doing. I'm moving away from coercive practice. So I said, "But excuse me, how do you do that?" And he says, "Well, quite simply, we hire nice people." Well, that was like dropping the gauntlet, really. You don't think we have nice people in the United States? We hire nice people too. So I said, well, I challenged him. I'm a little bit of a wise guy sometimes. And I said, what happens when the nice people leave? We hire their friends and family. So, okay, that's what they do. They hire nice people, friends and family. Turns out in Sweden, child behavioral health is born from education. It does not come from physical health or medicine. Their whole practice and discipline has an educational frame and focus, so that's their whole orientation. So the idea of using coercive practice with children is a complete anathema to them, and they hire nice people. Kathy Fuentes is a wonderful nurse manager, and she was hired to come oversee a program that I had that was in real chaos. And I'd asked the previous provider to move on because there was a completed suicide. There was a high rate of restraint and seclusion. Every youth in that program was traumatized, and every staff member was traumatized. So Glenn Sachs hired Kathy. He said, "You're going to love her, Janice. She's a dynamo. Wait till you meet her." In comes Kathy. No offense, but no, she was at least 72 years old. She comes in walking with a cane, shuffling. Oh, Glenn, this is the dynamo. We are in such trouble. These kids will make mincemeat out of her. And what I didn't realize is that Kathy walked with so many years of rock-solid leadership and confidence in knowing how to run an effective service. Nothing scared her. And it was like having your great auntie come by and give you the most natural, logical response. Kathy, what are you going to do with head banging? Oh, get a pillow, dear. And so we started to talk about what her hiring practice was going to be like. She said, well, quite frankly, I'm really not interested in the gifted and talented and experienced. Those people can go elsewhere. Kathy, we kind of need them. No, she said, I can train for skill, but I can't teach for attitude. And you get people who have already been working elsewhere and don't know our approach and the mindset that we want to bring. I can't undo all that background. Then my colleague Kevin Huckshaw and I were asked to go do a teaching on trauma-informed care and restraint and seclusion prevention in New Zealand. And we went to the headquarters of Fisher Paykel, which is like a medical supply industry, opulent setting, marble, chrome, floor-to-ceiling windows, elegant. Walk into the lobby, beautiful carved mahogany receptionist desk, woman sitting there, beautifully coiffed, highly manicured, dressed to the nines. And I look at her name, and her job plate says Director of First Impressions. Really? Director of First Impressions? I said, so, because I'm a wise guy, so what exactly is a Director of First Impressions? And she says, you don't understand. She said, I am Fisher Paykel. The first call that we get, whether it's from the Netherlands or whether it's from New Mexico or from Germany, I represent the company, and I represent all that we are, all that we do. I am everything about their statement and their possibility of success with Fisher Paykel. It is up to me to set that first impression and to meet every need that I am approached with. So that was a good take-home lesson for us about the importance of just at a very basic level, staff at every level need to be directors of first impressions to set the tone. These are the core qualities that we want people to be able to embody: being respectful, losing the focus on control and moving to collaboration and empowerment, and that we give staff important tools as well as those that we serve. I'm a big believer in data, and I'm the biggest fan of the Grafton data system. And this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues who kind of took the Grafton thinking, using it with one of their programs serving youth with developmental disability. And what they started to do was look at all the tense moments of conflict in the course of the day and be able to chart and show interactions and then what happened. Use of data told them they had a Thursday at 4 o'clock problem where there was a lot of conflict and a lot of storming and norming. They couldn't figure out what was going on. What was going on, that was staff meeting time. Staff would then go home, but not go back to the units where the kids were waiting for the staff to come back because they still had something they wanted to say, but the staff went home. And then what would happen is that behavior would erupt. So giving staff tools like data. We'll also give tools like soothing plans, we'll talk about that, and then adapting the environment with sensory integration and modulation. My state, we require that we have crisis plans, soothing plans, they all have different labels, but the intent is how do we acknowledge what somebody's trauma history has been, then use that information from the trauma history and embed it in a plan of support. For us, it's part of a beginning of a therapeutic dialogue and a relationship. It's a partnership and planning. And the key is it cannot be done by the professional for the person served, written for them in the professional's language, tucked in a chart, never to be known by the youth, the family, or our colleagues in the community. We use them as fundamental tools for staff and for the youth or person served. Because it helps them understand the pattern of what are the earliest stages of upset, what we do about it. And then fundamentally, if you're a risk manager, I look at this as having nothing different than a fire drill codified. How are staff going to respond if there is a problem? This is just creating a basic roadmap. It's required for all of our services. Very simply, these are simple components: triggers, early warning signs, strategies. If you're like me, you need a mnemonic to remember. I think of it as the ABCs. I think triggers is the antecedents, early warning signs, the behavior, and the strategies, or what's going to calm it and cool it and bring it back down. Triggers, not that trigger. Come on, this is Virginia. This is your gratuitous laugh line. You're all about horses. No. Who are the two people that laughed at trigger? That means you're over 40. Okay, second piece of useless trivia. I gave you the first piece. What was your first piece of useless trivia? Rats chirp. Okay. Trigger's original name was not Trigger. What was it? Ed, no. Golden Cloud. Where is he? No, that's how he is. He's in Branson, Missouri. Okay, we're not really interested in the horse. We're really interested in activating events that start a sequence of action. Oftentimes very clear, sometimes completely unknown. We ask questions, and this is the beauty of procedural learning, which is really basically a copycat of ABA. With ABA, you're studying pattern and sequence of behavior, and the professional really does the studying and noticing. With procedural learning, which is habit learning, we really want to rewind the behavioral tape with the person served and have them start to notice their own sequence of crisis. Oftentimes, they don't know. So what do we do? How do we find out? We ask basic questions. What makes you feel scared or upset or could cause you to go into crisis? We want to make it a cognitive exercise as well, because we got that CEO of the brain in place. People are then learning, and they're learning and building that wedge of cognition to be able to manage a crisis. So this is from one of my facilities. They wanted staff to stay mindful. If anybody wants this slide, you're welcome to it. If anybody wants this PowerPoint, you're welcome to it. So they wanted staff to stay mindful of triggers. Ross Green worked with Kathy Regan at Cambridge Youth Alliance and said that when they was helping them implement his collaborative problem-solving model, that every restraint, seclusion, moment of conflict started with a staff member enforcing a rule. What does a rule do? It draws a line in the sand. Graham Varney is the Director of Workforce Development of CAMH. It's the largest healthcare provider in Canada. They have over a 1,000-bed hospital. He's the Director of Workforce Development. Day one, what he's teaching all staff, whether you work in maternity or cardiology or you work in behavioral health, You are going to lose the word no here. We don't use no in this facility. Our job is to meet people's needs. When we say no, we have stopped meeting a need. We'll work with other language and other ways that we can understand and work with them, but we're not going to say that word no. Next, we go to those early warning signs. This is now the physical manifestation. We got that amygdala, right? It's starting to fire. We're starting to get that first sign of behavioral distress. This is usually catching somebody's attention. People get restless, agitated. I expect to see a little bit going on right now because you've been sitting a long time. This is when you get to be that low level of finger tapping or foot shaking or shifting your weight in your seat. That's low level agitation, and we're very used to seeing it and easily overlooked. But this is what we want to pay attention to, and this is why we want our colleagues to be good behavioral detectives and start to realize this pattern. Sometimes these behaviors are very clear, sometimes they're not. It could be a sensation of tightness of the chest. We don't know about it. Again, we want to ask the question, what might you or others notice? Again, they may not have an understanding, so we'll borrow the executive cortex of another to understand that pattern. Next, we want to look at strategies. You know, anybody heard of Pat Deegan? Pat Deegan is a woman with lived experience in the mental health system. She's a psychologist with a history of schizophrenia. She spent many years in psychiatric hospitals in Massachusetts. She's now an international consumer leader. She runs an organization called Empower. And she says, you know, strategies are really helpful. You know, medicine is helpful, and I need my medicine. It's really what I need to be able to control my illness. But personal medicine are the things that I can do to manage my illness. So personal medicine, to me, are the strategies that start to build the skills and the competence to be able to self-manage for self-regulation. So think of these as personal medicines. They're all individually driven strategies that work for some but not all. They all challenge us because we have routines wherever we work, and they challenge the routine. Can we drop everything and help somebody get outside? Can we take them out of the classroom? Can we start to do something different? They challenge us, and they're individual specific. Sorry, here's another screensaver from Noble Hospital. What do strategies in the kitchen sink have in common? Have you tried everything but the kitchen sink to help an anxious patient? Here they come. Again, they wanted their staff to stay mindful about the range of things that they can do when people start to become distressed. Okay, yeah, we got a flood. Okay, we'll move on. So we asked the question, what are things that help you calm down? Therapeutic touch. It's becoming a very important modality. I don't know if Virginia's like Massachusetts, but we threw that baby out with the bathwater about 15, 20 years ago, and the fears of allegations of sexual abuse or physical abuse came part and parcel with any kind of touch. But we took a page from Dr. Linda Field at the University of Miami, the Touch Research Institute. She's done a wonderful job at translating the power of touch and the efficacy of calming properties of touch on her website. So if you go to the University of Miami Touch Research Institute, you can pull up fantastic research on the calming properties of touch. But by touch, we're not talking about the kinds of touch that create problems. We're talking about simple hand massages. When you do hand massages, you're getting proprioceptive feedback to the joints and muscles, and you're getting calming. You know, when we're getting rocking sensation, we're getting a form of touch and movement that creates calming and relaxation. So that therapeutic touch, an important component. More strategies, spiritual practices, very important. We have the second largest Southeast Asian community in my state. The Buddhist monks are a very important part of our calming repertoire because they will come in and do coining ceremonies. So there are a lot of methods that can be used to promote calming and soothing, and these are but a few. Important things about whatever plan is created to help support someone to manage a crisis is that they're adaptable. They've got to be responsive to the individual needs. What we do with folks with dementia is going to be very different than what we do with children. Again, sometimes we may not have language. We created a pictorial tool for children or people who don't have good language skill. This is one corner of a 3-page tool. to help people start to translate experience. Again, make it a cognitive exercise. We're building the wedge of cognition, asking the same questions. How do I know if I'm angry, scared, or upset? This is a way to then codify it into a plan at what Children's Hospital is now doing, and then start to look at sensory needs and preferences. So how do we do this? We take a page from our colleagues in occupational therapy. Wonderful psychologist, OT researcher named Jean Ayres coined the term sensory diet. And we all have one, and there are no calories, so that's the good news. That fundamentally in our diet, we are either sensory seeking or sensory avoiding. And right about now, you're probably needing a little sensory experience because you've been sitting a long time and it's hard to stay focused and awake. So let's just talk about this sensory experience and how it really works. So bear with me. You with me? Okay. Everybody close your eyes and put your pencils down. And just be as quiet as you can. Okay, you can open your eyes. What happens to the energy in the room when it's quiet? It comes right down. Now I want you to turn to your neighbor, who you've already self-introduced to. Give them the biggest, the best smile that you've ever given anyone in your life. Oh, come on. I know there are great smiles. Turn to your neighbor and give them a big grin. So what happens when you turn to your neighbor and you give him that fantastic smile? What happens to the energy? It comes right up. Okay, now I want you to whisper something nice to your neighbor. Just whisper. Turn to your neighbor and whisper. You see what happens with the modulation of sound? Now I want you to go ahead and just sniff your neighbor. Little sniff. But imagine how you would feel if you walked into this room and it smelled like diesel fuel. But if you walked into this room and it smelled like, when we used to be able to sell houses, and the realtors would tell you, throw an apple pie in the oven or something. If you smelled an apple pie or something. So we all have comfort foods, comfort aromas. Now, you could turn to your neighbor. Tasting them is absolutely optional. But when you think about what you need for your own comfort foods as a way to help calm and relax, that's using Sensory Diet 101. So we have 5 well-known senses, and then we have 2 less-known senses, and this is proprioception and vestibular input. How many people went running this morning? Oh boy, this is a group that needs proprioceptive feedback. How many people played with their stress balls? Okay, you're doing some of it. How many people climbed some stairs today? Okay, you're good proprioceptive experts. This is getting feedback and a release of tension from the joints and muscles that helps to produce a state of calm. You do it by squeezing your stress ball, so everybody should be squeezing because you've been sitting here a long time and we want you to stay focused. We can do that through the tactile sensation also of playing with our putty and squeezing the putty. We can also get proprioceptive feedback when we do things like, this is what one of my programs does, they've introduced at snack time hors d'oeuvres. And they do hors d'oeuvres with kids who hate vegetables and fruits by slicing, dicing carrots, celery, apples, come out with a tray. Kids like the idea of hors d'oeuvres, and they're chewing and getting good nutritional information to their bodies, but they're also getting release of tension to the joints and muscles in the jaw. So I want you to, this is a prescription, I want you to chew on your licorice, I want you to chew on your Tootsie Roll, and if you need a little stimulus alerting to stay focused, you've got a Fireball. So these are all sensory tools on your table. Okay, we could also do vestibular input. Anybody do that today? Moms and dads, raise your hand. Your vestibular masters, vestibular input is rocking. It's that linear sway. The single most efficient method of calming down is the linear sway. That's why rocking chairs are appearing in all these airports. Okay, so you can stay grounded through these activities, and I have to move along because I know I've reached the end of my time, so I'll go fairly quickly now. You can stay grounded with weighted items, push-ups, you can stay focused. You can do a little chair pull-ups right now, get proprioceptive feedback to the joints. You can do wall push-ups when we take a little break. We could use your good wrist and ankle weights, or have your sour and fireball candies. We can self-calm with weighted items, shower, hot shower, decaf tea, rhythmic motion again, yoga, drumming. You're going to be doing that this afternoon. Wonderful. Meditation. And then what can we do to the environment that promotes comfort and learning and healing? We start to attend to it. We talked earlier about using your scanning tool to survey the environment and pay attention to what does it look like. Is this a place that I want to be? And these are just the sensory room at Cooley Dickinson, where Tina Champagne, if you're looking for good sensory intervention information, Tina Champagne is a national leader. She's actually done a lot of work in Australia as well. otinnovations.com. And she's got sample policies, procedures, and great resources that she makes available. So that's otinnovations.com. Tina Champagne, like the alcohol. Okay, this is a developmental center in my state where if you've got a lot of money, a spare $50,000, go get Snoozelen, great equipment, well-studied, well-researched, but highly expensive. These are just simple room conversions to great soft environments. This is the first place that took down their nurses station in our state, Franciscans, and now have their relaxation station. This is a building that's really very ugly and old, an old state hospital. They connected DBT to a calming area. All this, the items in this room were by donation, but they had youth be able to rate their level of distress before they went into the room. So we taught them mindfulness and had a written survey right at the door, so they would then identify the level of distress. We then had them rate their post-comfort room experience afterwards, so they could again start to track how they feel before and after the intervention and what skills they practiced while in there. We also teach them how to take their pulse and count respirations. So the nurses hate that when we do that. Oh, you can't do it. Yes, you can. How else are people going to understand stress in their body unless they are taught the skill? Staff need comfort too. This is a staff comfort room at a facility. No room for really interjecting these sensory experiences by way of real estate, so you can get a sensory cart. This has been widely adopted in New Zealand. They call them now sensory trolleys. Very simple construct of putting different sensory experience in each drawer and bring it to the person served. What we know is that sensory interventions are a phenomenal tool that can be used in place of PRN medications. Some of my psychiatrists were phenomenal. They'll write right into the treatment plan or a help in the ed plan. They need basketball PRN. If they're starting to get agitated, they need to get up and out. Phenomenal use, incorporating it into service plans, groups, classroom instruction, in-home adaptation for family. It's all well and good for work in our treatment settings. If it doesn't translate back home, if the families don't have the skill and the knowledge and the information about how to replicate this at home, we've missed the boat. Here are just a number of innovative sensory strategies. You can read it faster than I can speak it, but high-speed vibration takes a page from our colleagues and dermatologists. They've known this for years, that this creates topical numbing and soothing. McLean Hospital does frozen oranges. A lot of trauma survivors like to cut and really feel grounded by cutting, which is really not suicide, but it's just as much to stay grounded and focused. Sometimes frozen oranges can help with that. Specific sensory interventions to help with certain types of problems. And I'm wrapping up here that we know that sensory interventions really expands our toolbox. They help support people in crisis. They help to be able to manage traumatic reenactment, triggering experience, and we have a way for a person served to be able to assess their distress pre and post, like a pain scale, and fundamentally we are improving the therapeutic dialogue and experience. So I'm going to just very quickly just refer to this to let you know that there is trauma work expanding all over the country. The framework is being adapted in police stations and courts and homeless shelters and primary hospitals. There are towns that are coming, declaring themselves trauma-informed. There are prisons that are adopting trauma-informed approaches. There are trauma levels of certification that are now emerging, and new modalities and new pieces of equipment that are being developed by Tina Champagne and Brian Mullen, creating sensory compression vests that are heated to create some smooth muscle relaxation when there's significant costal muscle tension and trauma. That we're looking for new technologies. In Australia, they're teaching a whole new LEAP protocol, which is showing some robust findings. This is a sensory-based response in lieu of psychopharmacology, showing really good response by using sensory-based interventions. Neuroplasticity, I referenced this earlier. There are a lot of new teaching modalities about how to help heal the brain from trauma. And what's on the horizon? Don't be surprised that trauma-informed care practice is going to be embedded in expectations and standards of practice. Kudos to Grafton for declaring this as a first symposium content, because this is where leaders, thought leaders, are going. This is a redwood, what SAMHSA calls one of their redwood priorities. This is where, in my state, it is a statewide initiative. It is an expectation for every contracted provider to understand the impact of trauma and do something about it. So kudos to you all. I thank you all. Here are some good resources that are rounding the bend. I've already done my wrap up. So to become, sorry, it took a page from Mahatma Gandhi. I just like the quote. We must become the change we want to see. To become trauma-informed, we must become if we want to see it. So I thank you so much. I've included at the end of this presentation these great resources, and again, I'm happy to leave this material with you about online free resources, toolkits for assessment, and then my contact information if there's something I didn't cover. But I thank you again. This has been an awesome experience, and have a wonderful day. So thank you.